In 1913, just before the outbreak of World War I, the British Empire was at its peak, holding sway over almost a third of the world's population. A central idea justifying the domination of these hundreds of millions of people was the notion that Britain and its imperial counterparts in Europe had a duty to civilize the rest of the world and bring its peoples into the 20th century. This idea of the West and the rest has followed us into the 21st century and has been present in historical writing, both in academia and in the broader public domain. This phenomenon is often referred to as historicism, the idea that there is a linear progression of development which eventually leads to the so-called postmodern societies of Western Europe and North America. In 1978, Edward Said, a professor of literature and one of those responsible for the development of post-colonial studies, published his book Orientalism.
Orientalism began for two reasons. One was an immediate thing, that is to say, the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, which had been preceded by a lot of images and discussions in the media and the popular press, about how the Arabs are cowardly and they don't know how to fight and they're, always going to be beaten because they're not modern.
Focusing on representations of the Middle East and Arab figures in Western writing and popular culture, Said argues that Western scholarship reproduces reductive and contemptuous representations of the East and is inherently tied to imperialism and the existing power structures built within and around it. Development on Said's work, as well as the work of figures such as Frantz Fanon, Dipesh Chakrabarti, and many more, has continued into the 21st century. Chakrabarti discusses the dominance of European Enlightenment ideals as a pivotal point in the construction of a linear history of Europe which stretches uninterrupted from ancient Greece through to the present day. The application of this linear history to post-colonial nations assumes a timeline where they sit stagnating behind an advanced Western culture. The emergence of terms such as modern and postmodern show how Europe is used as a normalized template for the trajectory of modern societies. Europe is modern in relation to primitive societies elsewhere who only need a chance to catch up, and this is historically facilitated through empire and contemporarily through structural development and international development programs. The problems faced in the global south are then located in the cultures and practices of the people living there, not in the broader social, political realities they are embedded in. The argument stands that this strain of thought is used as justification for the treatment of the global south as subordinate and backwards, which in turn presents modern global intervention and domination by the West as a natural occurrence along the timeline of human history. So, often, when academics, politicians and commentators speak of the global south, it is done so with the presumption that the people living there are in an underdeveloped state, using archaic and outmoded understandings of the world to live their life, and therefore incapable of ruling themselves or being central to any historical narrative. This is done explicitly in the narratives of development, and implicitly, for example, in the white saviour tropes often seen on television and in film. Within this narrative, Europe and North America are rational, fair and modern, the sole gatekeepers of moral, economic and political authority. The authorities on human rights, social justice and civility. Said's take on Orientalism does have its critiques. Suzanne Marchand points out the divergent path German Orientalism took in the late 18th century. Marchand highlights the use of Orientalism to counter hegemonic and normative assumptions present in Germany at the time, and explores the more ambiguous nature of scholarship, taken into consideration that unlike other European countries, Germany did not have a global empire. Although racist assumptions still pervaded these narratives, The German approach often lauded the East as above the West, more enlightened and spiritually grounded. Marchand's critique is a useful example of a critical examination of Orientalism, which does not detract from the central arguments, but instead adds nuance and texture, which is central to developing critical historical inquiry. The emergence of historians working on post-colonial narratives of history brought about the development of innovative historical methodology and theory, which has changed the shape of historical inquiry. In the present context, conversations concerning decolonizing the curriculum have been circulating in different guises for decades. So what does this mean? In short, decolonizing refers to the process of undoing colonialization and the accompanying effects it has had on institutions, attitudes, and structures in society. To understand this in the context of historical scholarship in Britain, we need to understand its development. From the 1950s in Britain, Roland Oliver was integral in progressing the study of African history here. Setting up the Journal of African History in 1960, Oliver championed historical methodologies often dismissed in more traditional circles. This included linguistics, archaeology, and notably oral history. These methods opened up pathways to exploring histories not always based in written sources. Figures such as Professor Godfrey N. Nzuogwe and Dane Kennedy popularized the use of oral history as historical sources and discussing decolonization as an integral part of historical inquiry, respectively. These contributions allow for broader and more in-depth explorations of our shared pasts. How do we reconcile this with modern history in Britain and public consumption of that history? From discussions of decolonization to the felling of statues honouring long-dead slave traders, the complex and fraught nature of Britain's colonial history is meeting a very public reckoning in 2020. However, this reckoning is met with great resistance from members of the general public, as well as from public figures such as politicians and established historians. One main criticism is that these changes are actually a rewriting of history to suit modern sensibilities. This points to the linear and fixed way many of us are taught to approach history. However, these kinds of reimaginings are integral to valuable understandings of history. To understand this resistance, we need to ask what British historical inquiry tells us about ourselves and how it is currently taught. To take an example, in a YouGov poll taken in 2016, 44% of the participants expressed pride in Britain's colonial history, and 43% said they saw the empire as a good thing. A further 23% and 19%, respectively, said they held a neutral view of the empire and its morality. However, in a poll taken in 2019 asking, "Do you think that historical injustice, colonialism, and the role of the British Empire should or should not be taught as part of the national curriculum?" 69% of respondents answered yes, it should be taught. Within this context, it is easy to understand why challenges to this version of history are seen as threatening. The current curriculum in Britain leaves historical study of the colonial past and debates surrounding it as optional. However, many are open to the history being explored. Popular historians, such as David Olusoga, are creating space for more diverse and full histories of Britain in the public domain. Making post-colonial histories accessible to a broad audience outside of the academy is central to expanding contemporary conversations about the way our societies operate today. Olusoga's work still centralizes Europe, but begins to include people, events, and narratives that diverge from the linear, often jingoistic narratives of British and European history. Decolonisation has often been organised around white supremacy and imperialist intervention. To go further, our understandings and discussions of decolonisation need to be broadened to include more dynamic readings of colonialism and its manifestations in our modern world as structural. This means interrogating the role of class, gender, disability, and sexuality, as well as the multiple and contradictory ways these different identities interplay. Beyond this, we need to look at the intersections of struggle, resistance, and social movements. Seeing the world as interconnected throughout time can support an understanding of history beyond established narratives of unbroken linear heritage within monocultures. This includes disrupting the way education is practiced and perceived. Challenging the position of universities as sole producers of knowledge without critical investigation of their positions within broad structures is part of a decolonising practice. What can universities learn about historical inquiry from more informal forms of education? The way history, as well as many other subjects, are taught in Britain still reproduces the hierarchies of knowing implicit in the current structure. Where does a conversation about decolonisation sit within institutions who may receive funding from corporations who benefit from imperialist exploitation of resources and workers in the global south? Or who channel students off to work in government departments such as the Home Office, where they participate in overtly racist practices such as the deportation of migrants in the hostile environment? Learning from radical educationalists such as Paulo Freire, challenging accepted notions and practices of education are integral to embodying a post-colonial practice of history which can shed itself of historicist assumptions. One step in reimagining public discourse on history in Britain and beyond is best summed up by Freire himself. No pedagogy which is truly liberating can remain distant from the oppressed by treating them as unfortunates and by presenting for their emulation models from among the oppressors. The oppressed must be their own example in the struggle for their redemption.